Welcome to Have You Not Read, a podcast seeking to answer questions from the text of Scripture for the honor of Christ and the edification of the saints. Before we dig into our topic, we humbly ask you to rate, review, and share the podcast. Thank you.
Welcome to Have You Not Read. I'm Michael Durham, and with me are
David Casson,
Chris Giesler, Ken Smith.
And we are back with part 2 of our interview with Ken Smith, who was an elder here at Sunnyside Baptist Church and a teacher at Christian Heritage Academy. And we're discussing his classes where he teaches worldview and apologetics. And our first part of our interview, if you've not heard that yet, go listen to that first. And we have several follow-up questions and getting more into the details here. David, take it away.
Well, last time, Ken, you talked all about the curriculum that you went back several years. That CHA said, okay, we're going to revamp how we do this. And starting in 7th, 8th, 9th grade, so 7th grade, you have Old Testament, and then New Testament, and then hermeneutics, and you go into, I think you do 11th and 12th, where you're teaching worldview, and then in the 12th grade, you're teaching apologetics. When we left off, we were talking about how parents can be better involved. And parents at CHA, they don't just get to drop their kids off and get them, like a factory. It says, and they expect you guys to do all of it. You're really depending on your CHA parents to remain involved with their kids' lives and their education, asking them questions, and having their own students teach them some of the things that they're learning. One of the best ways to learn something is to teach. And then we talked a little bit about kids who aren't in that environment. And that's a wonderful environment. Really amazing to have that curriculum. But most parents that have their kids in public school are fighting a different battle. Mm-hmm. And what is that battle that they are fighting against?
Oh, I think of, Colossians 2:8. That's a verse that we use for Christian Worldview. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. In public school, you're gonna get a great education in math and science. If you're just dealing with how to do differential equations or how to do quadratic formulas or Algebra 1 or whatever. I mean, you're going to get a good education in that sort of stuff. If you're talking about, basic chemistry and basic physics and that sort of stuff, you're going to get a fine education in that. The problem's going to lie in what are the underlying assumptions to those various disciplines. There are places where I've read, we don't do this, but I know there are places that, 2 + 2 does not necessarily equal 4. That's just a social construct.
Math is racist.
Yeah. When you're looking at science like biology, okay, where did life come from in the first place? I mean, that's a huge hurdle to go from. If you take the evolutionary perspective, to go from, random inanimate matter to something that is now organized and that now is alive. How in the world does that happen? It's just assumed that it does, but how in the world could that possibly be? So, they're coming at it with some basic assumptions that are huge, that rarely get questioned. And if you do question it, well, now you're bringing religion into the equation. We can't do that. We have to have it's not only separation of church and state and government, but you can't bring religion into a public school classroom by raising those kind of questions. And so
you're not even allowed to question the starting premise. The operating assumptions from a philosophical level. That is, in their opinion, bringing religion into public school.
Right. And we're talking in broad terms here. I know that not every teacher is going to be in that boat. But when you look at public school generally, that's where they're coming from, is basically a materialistic, naturalistic worldview that assumes matter is all there is and natural processes are all that's at work. And the supernatural is automatically ruled out by that. And so, yeah, that's where you're coming from and all that. So those are some of the battles that parents of kids in public school, are having to push back against, and that's part of what brought us to Oklahoma in the first place, was for our kids to be in a school where we didn't have to fight those battles. So, yeah, that's and those are big battles. They end up dealing with things like, okay, if that's so, what is the nature of humanity? You're dealing with an anthropological issue here. What is the nature of man? So if you go with the assumptions of a secular materialist worldview, then what are we? Well, Francis Schaeffer would say we're nothing more than we're just machines. We're just clothed a little differently. We have different appearance, but we're nothing more than machines. And so what are machines? Machines are tools. And which is where Marxism takes all of that.
Where the human individual is really just an economic output.
Yeah, a means to an end. So all of those things, when you start evaluating it, have consequences. Ideas have consequences, and John Stone Street with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview says, and bad ideas have victims. Yeah, and so, yeah, you've got to learn to think clearly, ask good questions, understand that, yeah, ideas have consequences, and try and figure out what those consequences are.
So that is, we had already talked about how parents need to be, or CHA parents need to be involved. Public school parents need to be very involved and know your kids' teachers, know what they're being taught, and then discuss it with them.
Well, and I would add to that and say that those families need to take advantage of the church. Be involved in the church. Don't be just peripheral. You need the instruction that the church can give, and that's where the church has to be purposeful as well. Too many churches don't teach youth serious stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's
lots of
activities and fun stuff. And a good relationship shouldn't have that. But, particularly for kids that are in public school, they need to be confronted with some of these worldview kind of questions that they're not going to get otherwise.
Well, part of the problem in Evangelifish has been that in order to make sure that churches don't lose people's attention or support, is that they try to come at and say, well, it's okay for you to believe what you believe. Just make room for God. Just make a little bit of room for God. Let God be in your life. And there's no challenge of the fundamental anti-biblical, anti-Christ worldview, because that would be pushing people away. It's seen that you're pushing people away by saying, the Bible is likely to make you uncomfortable. And it's likely because it challenges some of your beliefs, some of your ideas that don't accord with God. And so in terms of getting involved in a church, it's not something where, we go to church because we want to make room in our life for God. Well, folks that take that approach have adopted the perspective being taught in the schools, that God belongs over here in this box, and you need to make room for him in that context, but he doesn't belong in these other contexts. And so that's where, if you don't have an education opportunity for learning to think fluently and thoroughly, across the board, from your schooling and so on and so forth, a church that will support that and promote that is going to be important.
David had mentioned you've got CHA, private Christian school, you've got public school, and they're probably exposed to a lot of different ideas, different type of worldview, and parents have to look out for that. And then you have homeschool, and I think there could be a tendency to maybe shelter or to have them not encounter other ideas. You're usually homeschoolers, it's intentional. They don't want them in a certain environment or something like that. They can't afford private school, but often it's to shelter from the world. What would be some things you would encourage homeschooling parents as far as apologetics go and engaging with these different types of ideas?
Well, I'm not entirely well versed in this, but from what I know and talking with families to a certain degree who are involved, like in classical Christian education, when you're reading good books, they raise worldview issues. If you stop and look and evaluate and ask questions. So, in the course of what you are reading in your literature, okay, stop and think, okay, what worldview is being presented here? How does this represent a biblical worldview or a pagan worldview? So I think literature has a big part to do with that, and just learning to analyze and evaluate. And I don't know of any homeschool person who doesn't believe in the value of good literature, So learning to use that part of your curriculum and analyze it well, think through it. And there's all kinds of stuff out there, I'm sure, that helps you do that and think through that. So it's not just do you understand the storyline, but what's the...
Asking questions, talking to your kid about what they're reading, the big ideas in the book.
Yeah, what are you getting from this? Are you seeing this element in it? So I think that's important. Yeah. Don't be afraid to ask people who have expertise, for help, and ask them questions along the way. Most homeschool families I know are very self-sufficient and do great research, but nobody knows everything. And so don't be afraid to ask for help or instruction, or, how can we augment this in some way?
Yep.
We had talked a little bit off mic about how the kids today that are in junior high, these are Gen Alphas, and then the kids that have gone off to college, these are some more the Gen Zers, are a little different than us.
Yeah.
They're just different. Not necessarily bad, but there are some challenges there. What are some of the things that you have seen teaching Gen Z and now going into Gen Alpha that parents and other teachers are teaching the same demographics? What should they be aware of? Who are these weird Gen Zer and Gen Alphas?
Yeah, well, we talked about that. So I thought it would be good for me to kind of I brought this along, Gen Z, born between 97 and 2009, they're roughly between the ages of 16 and 29 now. Gen Alpha, between 2010 and 2024, they're 2 to 16 years old. So that's kind of the age grouping. But, Yeah, this article from Summit Ministries is really helpful for me. You know, apologetics used to kind of focus on, philosophy and theology. That's where apologetics really kind of began. And then, along comes C.S. Lewis and Van Til and Schaeffer, and they take kind of this presuppositional, evidential approach to apologetics. And now with these younger generations, they seem to be more on the relational element. However, you can't overemphasize relationship and forget truth. And that's part of my concern is, this feeling that we've got to adapt everything to their felt needs. Well, yes and no. I mean, that's in every generation. We always have felt needs. Okay, that's a genuine thing. But just meeting a felt need, but never addressing the real issue or getting to what the truth actually is, all I've done is make you feel better, but not really give you anything of substance. So again, I kind of went around the barn there for a minute, but, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they are different. I was born in the middle of the baby boom generation. So, I'm 67 and a half. I'm old, and I admit that. And so my perspective on technology is way different than my students. They don't know a life without the internet. Most of them were given an iPhone, when they, were in junior high or before. So, yeah, they're very much tied to technology, and that has a huge influence on them for good or for bad. They have a lot of information at their fingertips, and they know a lot of stuff about a lot of things. But I think all of that serves to, they don't always know how to process that or what to do with all that information, which is why anxiety is commonplace. We've talked about that at CHA for the last 4 or 5 years and this is not just a post-COVID phenomenon. I mean, the indications of increasing anxiety among young people goes back several years before COVID ever hit and the isolation of that. That certainly exacerbated it, I think. But there were trends before that, and then the dependence on social media has only served to make that greater, I think. So, yeah, their relationship with technology and their smartphone, that's a big thing, which affects their mental health, and their focus on wanting good mental health is a big deal for them.
So the exposure to social media, as you've seen, is just increasing their anxiety, and you can see it among even some of the kids in your school as well.
Yeah,
but you guys have taken some steps to help combat that.
Yeah, I mean, we make them turn in their phones every day at the beginning of school in their first hour class, and they're locked up and put away. They have no access to them until school is out. That was a big step by our administration to do that. And there was always this, what are the parents going to say? How are they going to feel about it? Some of them were a little concerned at first, but it's proved to be a good thing. And it's interesting how the state legislature took that up not too long ago to mandate that in all schools in Oklahoma. So we were a little bit on the cutting edge on that. So that's kind of cool. So anyway, the media stuff, social media, digital stuff, that affects how they see themselves, their own identity, spiritually, that it is a common thing for them to see themselves as, having spiritual notions, but not necessarily feeling like they need to be tied to any particular religious institution, which is why it's easy for them to, like I talked about on this particular test, that they can score high on religion and yet score very low in terms of, being in favor of big government and socialist ideas and even socially very liberal. So they know what the Bible says, but there's a disconnect there between that and how you live your life. So I've got this religious knowledge, but I can compartmentalize that and live like the culture over here. Which leads then to, and I wanted to get this statement in, that their views on authority, identity, and inclusion, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, this is from this article, tend to view authority as optional, identity as flexible, and inclusion as a core value. So authority is optional, particularly, I think, not for everyone, but in the generation as a whole, they're very skeptical of authority. And that comes down even to biblical authority. So how do I respond to, authority at school, to the role of government? You look at the protests that have gone on in this country for the last couple of years on all kinds of different things that I think reflect that, and they see that, and there are really no consequences that seem to come out of that in terms of negative consequences. And so they're emboldened to push back against authority. Identity is flexible. Obviously that comes down in a lot of the sexuality stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then inclusion is a core value. That's the big thing, is to be a part of the group.
With talking about apologetics, that last point struck me, that inclusion is a core value, and tying that with anxiety. Humanity in its fallen nature is guilty and separated from God. What a hopeful message to say, the reason you're anxious is because you are separated from God, and God sent his Son to reconcile, right? That inclusion into Christ. There's hope. But then that goes along with the authority. God sent his Son. There is an authority, and this is what he says about the world. So then being relational, that might be a tie-in to the anxiety is there for a reason, but it can be a hook and a way to speak to them.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's a double-edged sword there, because I immediately started to think of, what was the most inclusive, society where everybody was together working on a common goal. And I was thinking the Tower of Babel. And our sinful natural tendency is to soothe that anxiety by gathering in a big group and saying, well, everybody else is doing it. Are you going to throw us all out? And God says, yeah.
Right. Well, in the tidal wave of information that, they're experiencing more as natives to the technology than others are, who perhaps come with a different skill set of combing through information in a different way and seeing it in a different perspective. If you are living in this tidal wave of information, more information than you can possibly comprehend and handle, anxiety is going to be very much the case with so much information coming at you, especially if there's no overarching authority who can be trusted with all that information. The inclusiveness becomes the default answer. With all this information coming in, everybody must be involved. Everybody must be brought in, because all of us together have to be handling all this information together. And if we're leaving somebody out, we're leaving information out. And so it there's a coherency to it, even in terms of even though some applications of it on the surface, it just doesn't make any sense at all. But the inclusivity is ultimately the great hope of how we're going to handle all this information coming in. Is we're not going to leave anybody out because we have to handle all of it.
You know what they call a drink where you put all of the drinks in the soda machine together all at once, right?
Yes.
Another part of that, as you were talking about that, made me think of, if inclusion and identity are so important, that really makes sense as to why identity politics has ascended. So there's no particular right or wrong, but I can find a group that fits my bent, what I want, what I like, what's going to, make me what I want to be. So I'm going to identify with them, and then I get included in that group. And so now I've found a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, because it fits my desire. And so truth becomes irrelevant. It's just what do I identify with, and how can I be included within that range?
And they tend to call that their truth.
Right.
They're now speaking their truth or living their truth. This is how I feel, therefore it is real. And since there is no objective truth, what you feel and you say is just as valid as what I feel I say, unless, of course, you say that my feelings are not valid. Then you're invalid and canceled. Did I get that right?
That's right. Yeah. So all truth is relative except for my truth.
Have you found that your students or the generation after them has lost some ability to reason with their using their smartphone all the time and asking ChatGPT and just looking to the internet and Google for their answers? Have they lost the ability to reason for themselves? Or do some of them still have it? It just looks different. Because it looks kind of weird to me, but I'm willing to say there's some generational differences.
Well, I don't know for sure on that. My tendency is to say, I don't know. We have really good kids at CHA, and I'm always amazed by their ability to think and to connect dots and put things together when they have to. But I also know, like all of us, we're all like water. We're all like electricity. We all want to follow the path of least resistance. And so it's easy to do that. It's even more easy to do that today when you've got resources like AI, like ChatGPT and all of that you can go to that, and I don't have to read. I don't have to process. I can get an AI summary of it and get the bullet points, and I'm good. Well, yeah, you are. You've got the information, but you haven't had to go through the process of sifting and thinking and putting things together and knowing what is good and what is not. You've just accepted whatever ChatGPT says. It may be perfectly fine, but it may not. And we know there are plenty of examples of AI doing horrendous things to people and convincing people of things that are patently untrue and sometimes with deadly results. So, yeah, that's another area of concern, I think, is in this digital revolution, what AI is doing and what do we do with that? I don't know that we know enough about it to think clearly. On the one hand, you've got people saying we don't have anything to fear, and on the other hand, you got someone saying you shouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. And I don't know. I have my own opinions, and I've done some reading and research on all of that, but there's still a lot that we don't know. And so, from my perspective, if I don't know, I probably don't want to mess with it until we do know.
AI summaries remind me of a listening technique that I've been reminded of recently. When you're having a very difficult conversation, a hard conversation, you're having some kind of civil discourse, even civil debate. A listening technique is to summarize what your, not necessarily opponent, but the person across the table from you has said. You summarize it. It says, is that correct? Do I hear you correctly? Yes, you do. It says, actually, no. Here's this. Okay, so my summary, I needed some tweaking on it. Do I understand it now? Yes, you've got it. If you're using an AI summary, you haven't gone through that process. You were just trusting. Is it so you don't have the ability to listen to someone's whole point? You're just waiting for that ChatGPT to spit you out the bullet points. You've lost patience. And so I think you're losing the ability to discourse civilly.
Yeah. And, at CHA, we've had a lot of conversations about what do we do with AI? How do we manage that? We know that students are going to use it. Mm-hmm. So trying to detect it, how do we hold them accountable? How can you use it as a valid tool? Which I think there are things you can do, but I think it has to be very narrowly defined and limited. Otherwise, yeah, you're just giving over your ability to think to some large language model that's going to spit out who knows what. So that's, I think, one of the challenges we have in education as a whole, but Christian education in particular.
I think, like you said, Christian education, and I think the other part of that is the character that's formed in us through Christ. And so patience. You need patience in order to have dialogue of differing opinions. You can't be lazy. You have to do the work. You have to study and research. So being diligent. Those characters that are shaped in us through Christ is what you need in order to do that type of thing. And so, like you're saying, as a society that's being lost, that's something that you have to teach. You have to teach those things. Yes, how to think. These are like, the logical steps and things like that. But then what if the child doesn't want to do it? Well, this is why we do it. Because 2 + 2 = 4. It's a truth statement. To say 2 + 2 = 5 is a lie. And God is not a liar. We're created in the image of God, so we have to speak the truth. It's hard work. Well, we need to do hard work. Our God is a creative God who worked for 6 days, then rested. And so teaching those principles that we're created in an image and have a purpose lets us reason correctly.
So we've used a lot of big words and terms. We talked about AI, and there's a lot of information out there. There's actually a lot of resources for parents. It can be a lot to sift through, but there are. We talked about using your local church to sift through some of these resources that's available for homeschool, public school, and private Christian school parents. But then you have the parents that are new. They're new Christians, and they want to send their kids to a place like CHA, which is great, or they want to homeschool, or it says, look, our kids are in public school, and I just want to help them defend themselves and think through these things. For parents like that who are new, where can they start? You had said that you definitely don't want to just drop your kids, even if they've been in these wonderful Christian family. They grew up in the church, and say, yeah, that's no determiner of their success. The parents have to stay involved. So even the people that got this great legacy have to stay involved. So that doesn't, that part is irrelevant. Whether you're brand new or you're 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 10th generation Christian, you have to be involved in your parent, and as parents have to be involved in your student's life.
Yeah, I don't know. What comes to mind off the top of my head is for those people, I think it's important. What do you believe? And why do you ask yourself those questions? Why do I believe what I believe? Can I articulate that? How is it that I have come to believe that the Bible is a trustworthy source of not just information, but for my eternity, that I base my whole eternity on what God has said about who Jesus is? Why do I believe that? How did I come to that conclusion? So asking yourself how do I know that God exists? Why should I believe that there are only two genders when the world is telling me that, there's a whole plethora of options out there? Why should I say there's only male and female? Just some of those questions that come up, and just, first of all, can you answer them for yourself? I think is a place to begin. So educate yourself and dig and read. Be a diligent student of God's Word. So, I just went through a thing with my seniors about the discipline of Bible intake. We're talking about spiritual disciplines. And so the discipline of Bible intake. So hear it, read it, study it, memorize it, meditate on it. All 5 of those things. And there are various things you can do even under those 5 main categories. So am I doing that regularly? Not just on Sundays, but throughout the week, daily? Am I doing that for myself? And then, Paul writes to Timothy and says, when you come, bring the parchments, but bring the other books as well. So educate yourself with other good helps that support your understanding of a biblical worldview and these issues of the authority and inspiration of Scripture and all of that. So educate yourself first and be a lifelong learner. Just understand you're not going to get to the end of that path. I'm 67 and a half, and I don't even know. Well, I know that I don't know. That's what I know. And I'm trying to always learn. I have a list of books on a note thing in my smartphone. Yes, I have a smartphone. Books that I want to get and buy and read. And my wife and I read books together and read our Bibles together. And, those kind of things help solidify your faith and build you up in that and equip you to serve the church and serve your family. And so those are, I think, places to begin.
So that's a really good segue into the kind of the next section that I was hoping to get to, is that kind of keeping it at the introductory level. Can you give us an overview of some of those major schools of worldview and apologetic thought, in particular apologetic thought? You kind of go through some of their strengths, weaknesses. If somebody was kind of starting out, what should they be kind of looking for? If you were going to organize some of these schools of apologetics, defending your faith, explaining the Christian faith, and you want these new Christians, these parents, to say, what do you believe? Okay. Do you actually believe that Scriptures are true, that Christ has come and will come again? I mean, do you believe this, and can you articulate it? Can you go through some of those approaches on how people in the past have defended their faith?
Oh gosh, Michael probably could do better at that than I. I am very blended, I guess, in my approach to apologetics. So I wouldn't say that I'm. I'll talk to my students about philosophers, and what they have believed. We'll talk about Hegel and Kant and Nietzsche and stuff like that, and where they're coming from. So, you're dealing with the philosophical aspect of things. So talk about that sort of stuff, and that's good and helpful. And there are many good Christian philosophers out there that can help unravel some of those things. We're talking about evidences for the existence of God, the cosmological argument, that the very nature of the universe itself is such that it leads one to believe that this could not be an accident. But that's a philosophical argument, also evidentiary argument to a certain degree. You're dealing with science, you're dealing with all these cosmological constants that are these massive numbers and stuff that couldn't just happen. I mean, you look at the finely tuned aspects of the universe, the gravitational constant, and so now I'm into the teleological argument for the existence of God. And so then you're looking at science and math and all that sort of stuff. And then you go to the ontological argument, which is really philosophical, about that God is the uncaused cause, that he is the necessary being, that everything has to come from. Nothing would exist without God. And then the way that philosophers go through all of that, so I don't know. I'm probably not the best person to say this is what this is, because I really kind of take from everywhere, because I think there are things that are helpful from all of those different aspects of apologetic approaches. Presuppositions. One of my favorite definitions of worldview is from James Sire, his book, The Universe Next Door. And, he said a worldview is a set of presuppositions. And then he puts in parentheses, okay, what is a presupposition? Assumptions may be true, partially true, or entirely false. So a worldview is a set of presuppositions which we hold. And then he says, and we hold these presuppositions consciously or unconsciously, consistently or inconsistently. Mm-hmm. And that those presuppositions, those assumptions are about the basic makeup of the world. That's probably the first definition of a worldview that I ever memorized, So it's rooted in a presuppositional notion. And I think we operate, either God is or God isn't. And the presuppositions that we hold them about all kinds of things, and we don't even think about it, and they may be true, partially true, or entirely false, but that's where we're coming from. That's where we start. So
it'd be very helpful for people to have just a list of key terms in front of them as they start to says, well, I want to learn more about some of these arguments that people have used in the past. Occam has used some, and Anselm, and some of these, Aquinas, and some of these guys, and you got to be careful jumping into that deep end. As Jonathan Edwards, he dug too deep and found a Balrog. You can really get yourself into trouble,
right,
going into places that the Bible does not go.
Can I say one of the things that I have included in apologetics that I found to be really helpful is just a short section of looking at some of the foundational creeds of the church, like the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. I mean, all of those came out of an attempt to try to deal with some sort of false idea, some sort of heretical idea. And so to a large degree, those early church creeds are apologetic arguments in and of themselves. So, if you kind of walk through some of those and just deal with the terms and the concepts that are in those creeds, if you just take the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, you're going to deal with the nature of the Trinity and the and Christology and soteriology and pneumatology and, all of those kind of things come up in those creeds, and they were meant to be easily remembered, dealing with basic truth. And so I think those are helpful ways of dealing with foundational biblical truth through that resource.
Keeping the main things the main things.
Yeah.
Now, apologetics, like sanctification, is occasional, meaning there's particular occasions attached to it. So even as you read through the scriptures, and for many of the books of the Bible, there's a very particular reason why that book was written. There's some issue, some concern that is being addressed. We could take the Pauline epistles, for example. There's an issue that's being dealt with here. There's a false teaching, or there's a question being answered. Something is being handled, and that's what the creeds of the church were also about. And this is generally how the saints, the believers, get into apologetics. You get a knocking at the door, and there's a Jehovah's Witness. You get a professor who says anybody who disbelieves evolution is an idiot. You get challenged on something particular. There's an occasion, and then you begin to try to respond to it. And this is where you're going to, on the experience level in Christian apologetics, you don't really start by thinking in terms of presuppositional, evidentiary, and classical apologetics, and go broad and wide and see all the different approaches. In general, you're just trying to defend the biblical account of the flood. And in the course of that, you're going to be drawing on, even if you don't really realize that you're doing it, you're going to be drawing on these different categories. Mm-hmm. You're going to be reading articles from Answers in Genesis, and you're going to watch this video on YouTube, which is an excerpt from, is Genesis history, and you're going to be helped with all sorts of evidentiary stuff, and then someone's going to challenge you on that and say, well, you can't use those resources because they're already partial. And then all of a sudden you're going to have to answer that question. And now you're going to have to pick up the presuppositionalist approach and say, by what standard, and getting into that. And you're going to have to draw on all sorts of aspects of apologetics. If you're teaching a class and you're trying to give people a broad view, if you're really interested in the subject matter of apologetics and becoming more of a well-rounded student of it, that's when you kind of go wide. Otherwise, it's occasional. I've got a particular challenge, maybe about the deity of Christ, maybe about his resurrection, maybe about the reliability of the scriptures. And I've got to defend this pressing, burning issue in my soul. And God uses that to grow Christians up, to push them through challenging things. And they begin to, like we said in the last episode, that passage, sanctify Jesus as Lord in your hearts, and always be ready to make a defense for your faith.
But you're making a defense because you've been attacked.
That's right.
So that's when it goes back to that occasional use of it. Okay.
Exactly. And so in that sense, someone may really be inclined and interested in that and begin to formulate arguments and get ready to answer questions they've not yet been asked. Mm-hmm. That may be a real interest for someone, and that's great. But for most Christians, it's occasional. And, I've been pressed here. I've got to respond. And that's usually how apologetics develop in the Christian life. It's particular questions. And the questions change. In certain generations, it seems the main rebuttal and objection to Christianity is the reliability of the Bible. And then the next generation, it's about the flood or about the creation account, which is related to the reliability of the Bible, but it's a different focus and shift. Or the most recent attack on the scriptures has really been the scriptures are immoral. The Bible itself advocates for all manner of evil, wicked immorality. The Bible is full of hate, and therefore you shouldn't follow it. And so, in each generation, we're called to stand up and give a defense and give witness to Christ and confess His name, and whatever those objections are, they're going to change over time. But whatever's being thrown, we've got to hit that pitch.
That's the danger with going back, let's say, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and using some of the older apologetical arguments that were going against an issue that was they were dealing with here. And says, well, it worked then, and that's how we won the last war, so that must be the right technique to win this one. And that's not always the right tool for the job. And what's nice is that there are experts in the church, the people that sit around and do go through some of this stuff and write books. Say which one about William Lane Craig. He has written some. He's challenged people on some interesting ideas, and he is a powerful and intellectual mind. You know, listening to James White, Satan Brugengate, and Craig Blomberg, and just some of these guys, these great authors. You know, reading some of these classics, reading about Anselm, and going through some of his arguments, I think are very helpful. And I was one of those guys who I started thinking about those things, and I started reading those books, anticipating arguments that may come. I wasn't actually going against a particular attack at that time until the first one came from my brother. But that's another story. That was a creation one.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, for me, my interest in apologetics goes back to high school. I loved science, and so in biology and all that stuff, I'm just confronted with origin questions and stuff like that, and so read about that sort of thing and try to answer those kind of questions that I had that were coming up in class. They weren't attacks per se, but they were just things that were being raised. I went to public school, and so my interest in apologetics goes back that far and has stuck with me. And you talk about the current thing. I think there are always those same issues that come back around again and again and again. The authority and reliability of the Bible, that's always going to be under attack, I think. The deity of Christ.
Person of Christ. Yeah.
Those kind of things are always going to be things we have to be ready for. I think one that has been rising, and Carl Trueman is just coming out with a new book about the desecration of man and dealing with the nature of who we are as human beings. So the issue of anthropology, our human, what does it mean to be made in the image of God exactly? And I think, and I've just been thinking about that for a while. I think that is a big issue that's at the heart of a lot of different things going on. So that's something I plan to try and learn more about and educate myself better on. Anyway.
Well, if we could, as we talk about, it's okay to kind of have a broad brush. It's okay to kind of take an eclectic approach, or not really eclectic, but a combination approach for the situation at hand. And you don't have to be an expert in all of these terms. But if you were going to define your personal apologetic, is it a combination of the classical and presuppositional and evidentiary in some way?
Yeah, I would say so. I just kind of draw from a lot of different areas, I love R.C. Sproul. His book, The Consequence of Ideas, is really helpful in terms of understanding the flow of ideas throughout history and different philosophers and seeing how that's come along. I talked about the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. That's a very evidentiary approach. Francis Schaeffer, I love Francis Schaeffer. I've read a lot of books by Schaeffer, and he is largely a presuppositionalist. And, so all of those things kind of filter into what I think and all of that. So
when you talk about classical, and I like that view, and that's the one where you have to rationally go through natural theology and you come to theism, and then step 2 is to say this is why the Christian view, based upon evidence and logic and reason, is why it is the superior view, or even the only view. And that made a lot of sense to me, but I found that it's really helpful with other Christians to help them articulate and defend their faith. Wasn't very good. I never convinced anybody who wasn't a Christian. It's like their hearts were darkened and they didn't quite understand what I was saying. So at some point you have to recognize the limits of what you're doing, and that person's heart is not in your hands. It sure can be an evangelical tool. You can share the gospel through it, but a lot of these approaches seem to be strengthening and edifying to those who already know Christ. Have you seen that to be true? Are there ways that you can use this in more of a sharing the gospel or evangelistic setting, or do they really belong in the strengthening of the church?
No, I think it's a both and thing. Again, it depends on the situation, the occasion. You go back to 1 Peter 3, and there are people who have questions. Some people just want to ask gotcha questions and try and paint you in a corner, but there are people who have honest questions. And so we may not have, there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know, but I will find the answer and get back to you. If it's a significant thing, God has made it known and it's out there. I may not know it myself, but I can find it. So there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know. At the same time, we are called to be prepared, to be ready, to give a reason for the hope that we have. So study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman who does not need to be ashamed, who rightly handles the word of truth, who rightly divides it. So be a good student of God's word and be as prepared as you can be for those questions when they come. So I look at apologetics as both a sanctifying tool in the life of a believer to help them to grow in their own faith. I mean, I have questions, and so I'm trying to answer those questions in my own mind. So it's a sanctifying thing, but it's also a seed scattering thing. You talked about people aren't necessarily converted by apologetic arguments. Sometimes they are, but that's up to God and His sovereignty over all of that and how He calls them. So I think we just have to look at apologetics in terms of evangelism as like everything else. Some sow the seed and some water. Ultimately, it's God who brings the harvest. And so that's all that we're trying to do is scatter and water and trust that God will use our feeble attempts, to be faithful. And He does. And so that's all we're trying to do with that.
If you would, you'd be willing to do this. If someone had you at the point of the sword and said, give me your defense. Why do you believe what you believe? What would you say? How would you use the education that you're giving to your students and that you're trying to master yourself? How would you defend your faith? Well, what would you use all of these amazing books and these incredible authors and these wonderful thinkers that you've been exposed to, that you're exposing your students to, and that you're encouraging parents to learn about as well. If you were put on the spot, how would you use it to defend the faith that you hold dear?
It seems to me the bottom line in all of it, you can talk about evidences for God and everything else. The bottom line is, who is Jesus? Who do you say that I am? And, Paul was in that situation in 2 Timothy. And, he said, I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced that he is able to guard what I've entrusted to him to that day. It comes down to, what do you think about Jesus? Who is he? And everything that I know tells me that my Redeemer lives, that Christ died for my sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, that he will return. And every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And some will do so out of joy, and some will do so out of terror. But Christ is Lord. That's one of the things Michael said this years ago, and it just so much resonated with me, was the message of the church from the beginning. Jesus is Lord. That's what set them apart. And so it's ultimately all about Jesus. And, you can study the apologetics and the evidences for the resurrection and all of that, and that's all good and helpful and necessary and just serves to shore up my faith. But in the end, it is, I know that Jesus lives, and he bore my sins in his body on the tree, and I trust him. He is my Lord. And so that's where I go.
Does anybody have any follow-up or additional questions to that?
I appreciate you very much coming and spending time with us and sharing your well-reflected on thoughts regarding this important topic, apologetics and worldview, for not just youth, but also for all the saints. Very much appreciate that. Let's go ahead and wrap up with some recommendations on resources that would be helpful to believers and others. And then after that, we'll wrap up our episode with Thanksgiving. David, do you have any recommendations?
Yes, in prep for this episode and some of the questions, I pulled a book off my shelf called 5 Views on Apologetics. And this, it's an anthology, and it has a number of authors. Classical apologetics, you get William Lane Craig. For the evidential approach, Gary Habermas. You have cumulative case, which is the case for Christ. Presuppositional, John Frame, and then Reformed epistemology. So a bunch of different terms and things in there. But what I found very helpful about this book is the introduction gives a summary of each one. And then there are key terms and concepts about 4 or 5 pages long. So you can use this as a reference, and you can say, if I want to learn more about this approach or this approach, I can dive into it. But I think the strength of it is that intro and then those key terms, some of the things that we had talked about tonight. As you go through some of these topics and go through some of these harder books, some of these giant tomes that some of these really smart guys write, having a list of terms just next to you, it's helpful.
Chris, what about you?
I read a book a while back. This is an apologist that I greatly respect. He does a lot of philosophy, but he wrote a book called Tactics. His name is Greg Koukl, and I really enjoyed him. It's very conversational, just asking questions and just talking. He says the goal is not to convert them there on the spot, but basically to sow the seed. He uses the phrase, you're just trying to put a pebble in their shoe. You're just trying to get them to take something with them that'll make them a little bit uncomfortable, that they have to sit and stew over and think on. One of the tactics is called the Columbo tactics. It's named after an old TV show. Columbo was a detective.
David grew up watching that.
Right.
I loved Columbo.
Yeah.
Peter Falk.
Yes, and so his method is, I've got another question. Something about that I've got another question. We are to speak truth, but when people make claims, it's okay to press them on what they believe. Ask them questions. Because sometimes when they're explaining what they believe, they'll realize it doesn't make sense. And then they have to sit with that. So questioning theirs, tearing down those strongholds, as Paul says, taking every thought captive, making it obedience to Christ, and then speaking the truth. Make them put off what they believe and put on Christ, give them truth. So I recommend the book Tactics by Greg Koukl.
Excellent. Ken, I know you have a long list. Maybe you could give us just kind of a handful of what you think.
Yeah, a couple. One that I think is really good. You're not going to get through it in a couple of nights. It'll take you a while to get through it. But Total Truth by Nancy Pearcey is a really good book on worldview. She studied under Francis Schaeffer at L'Abri and brings a lot of that into that book. And so it also was written way back in the early 2000s, but it is still a good resource. I would also say just Francis Schaeffer. I've loved Francis Schaeffer for years, and what's called the Schaeffer trilogy, I would really recommend. So Escape from Reason, The God Who Is There, and He Is There and He Is Not Silent. So those three books together really kind of form the foundation of Schaeffer's philosophy and apologetics. So I would really recommend that. And then one other Schaeffer book. Where is it? I just looked right at it. How Should We Then Live? How Should We Then Live? Which really is kind of a sweeping view of the history of philosophy and the influence of Christianity through the centuries in offsetting opposing ideas. And he looks at a lot of it. One of the things I like about Schaeffer is, he looks at stuff like art and literature and how all of that has influenced the way people think. And so those things by Schaeffer, I think, are really helpful and good. You have to kind of go slowly and think, but it's worth the effort to go through that. And a podcast that I listen to often is Breakpoint. Comes from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, John Stone Street. They do a daily one that's about 5 minutes long, and then a longer one on the weekend where they deal with all kinds of topics and stuff. But I've found that to be a helpful resource just on current things they keep up with. And so, yeah, that's a good one.
Thank you, Ken. I think one of the things that comes out most clearly in some of these apologetic moments is that the person objecting to the Bible, the gospel, God, and so forth, very often have an unexamined epistemology, and they've not really worked through why it is that they're making these knowledge claims and how they can be certain of it. And they just, in some cases, are very ill-equipped to, and usually not desirous to have that kind of conversation. And so you have to find a way to try to invite them to back the truck up and say, hey, before you drive the stolen vehicle. Let's go figure out where it was that you hotwired this thing because it's not yours. Let's go talk about how did you come up with this idea other than there was this cool dude on YouTube. And so there's a book by Roy Clauser. It's called The Myth of Religious Neutrality. And I think in some ways he's rooted in some of that Dutch Reformed epistemology that's so helpful from Bavinck and Van Til. But it really is, hey, let's examine what's really going on here. And even though there are many claims of religious neutrality in various schools of thought, whether mathematics or geology or whatever it is, so how can religion ever be a part of these academic disciplines? He walks through a particular definition of what the divine is and how all human thinking assumes the divine in all cogent thinking. And it's inescapable. And it's a variant on the transcendental argument that Van Til would bring forward, but it comes down to the very basics of human reasoning must assume divinity in order to progress. And so I found it a very interesting approach and discussion. All right, so what are we thankful for tonight? David?
I'm very thankful for a very good traveling trip. Since I'm in the travel industry, I'm in and out of airports all the time, but I don't travel as a passenger very much. And Amy and I did some traveling this past weekend, and this was right on the tail end of all the TSA madness and spring break madness, and we just didn't know how it was going to go. And not only did we wake up on time and we got there early, there was no line at baggage and the ticket counter, and there was a very short line for TSA, got in, even had time for coffee, and just all the flights went great. And then we got into Washington Dulles, rented our car, we had a nice safe trip going into Maryland. And then the exact same thing happened on the way back. It was one of the most pleasant and easy trips that we've had with nary a hiccup. So I'm just very thankful that you always have to be prepared, be prepared for the worst, but it's really nice when it goes smoothly. And I'm just really thankful for a smooth, safe plane and car travel this past weekend.
Okay, Chris?
So I'm afforded a job that lets me work remote sometimes. And so I sit with my work every day, day in and day out. It was a blessing today to be at home working and then to hear the various stages of my wife's day, the things that she endures and patiently works on, the breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and working with the kids, the schoolwork, and all of that type of stuff. To see that and just to know there's work going on there as well, to hear how diligent she is and the things that she has to do. It's such a blessing to our family just to have her, and then to know that there are things that she's doing for the service of her children, for me, work that gets done that we don't notice, that just happens. I've got clean clothes. I don't know how, that's just a nice thing to have, and clean dish, all that good stuff. But just that she's doing those things in the service of her family, and I'm so grateful and thankful for the blessing that she is.
All right, good.
I'm thankful for Sunnyside Baptist Church on a lot of levels. I wouldn't be teaching at CHA if it wasn't for Sunnyside, because Sunnyside people here were the ones who started the school back in 1972. I'm grateful for Sunnyside, not only for that reason, but this is where my family has been since the early 2000s. I've had the privilege of teaching Sunday school to a whole lot of people over the years here. I had the privilege of being a pastor here for 6.5 years, the privilege of being an elder here now, the blessing of the body at Sunnyside and how God has grown the church through Michael's ministry here for the last, how long have you been here? 10 years-ish?
I mean, 12 years.
12. Okay. Man, you are old. You know, just all of that and just how the Lord has knit this body together and the ways in which He is glorified in this church. You know, I've been talking to my seniors about the church and the blessing of the local church. And yeah, tomorrow my lesson's going to be about membership and why that's important. And I am grateful for all that Sunnyside was and is and will be as we seek to follow Christ. So I'm thankful for this church.
Well, I'm thankful for you, Ken. As one of our elders here, thankful that you were very gracious when I first called you about coming to be pastor here, when you were with Cheryl in Illinois caring for her parents, and thankful you all came back when the Lord provided for you to do so, and that you all came back here and that we get to serve together as fellow elders here at Sunnyside. So I am very grateful for you, grateful for your ministry and the blessing you are to the saints here, and thankful that the Lord in His providence put you back at CHA to continue to teach these youth, these juniors and seniors as they come through, and to take your gift as a teacher into that school as well, not just here at Sunnyside. So
Thank you.
very, very appreciative of that.
And that wraps it up for today. We are very thankful for our listeners and hope you will join us again as we meet to answer common questions and objections with Have You Not Read?